Tensions are boiling over between former allies Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. And the reason is simple. They started a war on Iran together, and now just one of them is negotiating with Tehran how it'll end. Israel considers Trump's signing of a memorandum of understanding with Iran a capitulation to the mullah regime. Netanyahu wants to keep fighting. In fact, in Lebanon, Israeli forces are still clashing with Iran's proxy Hezbollah. That's a non-starter for Tehran and an issue that threatens to derail the talks currently being held in Switzerland. Is this just a bump in the road or an existential challenge to a once solid alliance? On To The Point, we ask, Trump versus Netanyahu, is the U.S. betraying Israel for a deal with Iran? Welcome to The Point. I'm Nicole Fröhlich in Berlin, and I'm pleased to introduce today's panel. I'm joined by Hans-Jakob Schindler. He's the Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project and has spent many years living in and working on Israel and Iran. Emily Gordine is also with us. She's a correspondent at DW's studio in Jerusalem, and Richard C. Schneider joins us as well. He's a freelance journalist and a longtime Middle East correspondent. Thank you all for joining us today. I want to start with you, Emily. The U.S. and Iran are discussing an end to the war without Israel at the table. How are these negotiations being viewed in Israel?
Well, many Israelis are extremely skeptical of these negotiations. Some of them are also quite angry that Israel was essentially left out of these negotiations, and many effectively see this as a way of betrayal, given that it was the US and Israel together who started this war, and now it seems that it is the US alone who is deciding on how this will end.
Richard, would you say Israelis are right to feel betrayed by the US president?
Well, in a way, yes, because what we can see in the memorandum of understanding, which was signed by Iran and the US, this memorandum is not taking into account the most important issues for Israel, which is not only the nuclear issue, but also the ballistic missile problem, and of course also the proxies. So just from an existential point of view, Israel cannot be happy with this memorandum at all.
And Hans-Jakob, for Donald Trump, was this war ever about Israeli security?
Look, I mean, I think there were a couple of aspects here. There was an opportunity to actually see if he can destabilize the regime. And I think both sides really started with that. The problem is that they started with the attempt to really destabilize the regime, to either weaken the country so it can't develop a nuclear program, or change to the regime that has no interest in having a nuclear program. And they ended up with what was unavoidable in 2026, i.e. another setback for the nuclear program. And that's really the worst of both worlds, because now the concessions that are necessary to be made to stabilize the situation in the region, at least temporarily, are going to be much larger than if they would have been if this would have been the quote-unquote smaller version, i.e. a short military operation against the nuclear program in Iran only.
Mm-hmm. Emily, I want to look at the rhetoric that we've seen coming out, not just out of Israel, but also of the U.S., because they're not really taking Israeli criticism on board here. Responding to some remarks from the Israeli government, the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance lashed out at Israel publicly, essentially telling them to not bite the hand that feeds them, that the U.S. was essentially the only ally they had left. Is that going to change anyone's mind over there?
The rhetoric certainly has gotten much harsher, and that is something that is of concern to many Israelis, given that the US is Israel's most important ally. That being said, and Richard already just alluded to this, Iran's nuclear program, these proxies that Iran has, and the ballistic missile program, altogether, that is seen as an existential threat to the country. And many Israelis claim that, this is not something that you can negotiate. This is not something that they can just watch and unfold and and they essentially pay the price of what Iran is doing there. So while many Israelis are wary of what is going on, of the rhetoric coming out of the White House, they're also not willing to make any compromises when it comes to their existence, as what they describe it, and as of their security.
Hans-Jakob, this deal is being criticized across the board, not just in Israel, also within Trump's own party. Why do you think he would settle for the terms that we're seeing in the MOU? Why would he accept a deal or embark on negotiations towards a deal that would be so unfavorable for their close ally in the Middle East, for Israel?
Well, I mean, first of all, that MOU, which started this negotiation process, has fulfilled a very simple domestic purpose. At the moment, the discussions on the reflecting pool is competing with the negotiations in Iran and the headlines. So it got it out of the headlines in time for the election campaign for the midterm elections in November. However, I think it's very unlikely that this negotiation process is actually going to lead to some kind of larger scale permanent agreement, simply because the US has written into the MOU such a massively large economic carrot for Iran. So it's not just the old sanctions that they can reinstate all the time, but they say if for a eventual agreement, they would be willing to relieve all unilateral sanctions, all UN Security Council sanctions, at least manage to try to attempt to do that, as well as sanctions within the EIA in Vienna, plus an investment fund of $300 billion. So this is such a massive carrot that the concessions that the Trump administration will need from the regime would be so significant that it would essentially mean it's a different regime. It would need to suspend its enrichment program minimum for this amount of money, and potentially even rethink its relationship with its proxies, as well as limitations to its missile program. That anything below this threshold would be very, very, very tough to sell for the Trump administration domestically, not just to the public, but also internally to the Republican Party. Hence, I think we are looking forward to an unending negotiation process, at least until the midterms are over.
Would you agree, Richard?
Totally.
I want to look at the relationship of these two leaders, of Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, because over the years, it's seen its ups and downs. With the open disagreement now over the war in Iran, it seems like this political bromance between the two leaders might be unraveling once and for all, and that could have a huge impact on the U.S.-Israeli alliance. Let's take a look.
They've known and cared about each other for decades, Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. They're both friends and business partners. But since their dispute over the Iran deal, Trump has made one thing clear. He's in charge.
Without me, there would be no Israel, because no other president was willing to do what I did.
The vast majority of Israel's arms imports come from the U.S. Geopolitically, the two countries are closely intertwined. Last summer and again this spring, they went to war against Iran side by side. But Trump has since pushed for a swift peace in the region, a move Netanyahu has rejected. Israeli forces have continued fighting the Iran-backed Hezbollah and continue to occupy parts of Lebanon. Reports have claimed Trump grew angry at Netanyahu, insulting the Israeli PM.
I did. I wouldn't say angry. I was a little bit perturbed at his constantly fighting with Lebanon.
Trump and Netanyahu, the end of a friendship?
Richard, is this a personal disagreement or a moment that could redefine the relationship between the U.S. and Israel?
Well, I think it's both. On the one hand, it's a personal issue right now, even though both sides say, no, it's not. We are still good friends. We're still buddies. But and also President Trump already went a few steps back, so to speak, and say, no, I still like him. And Bibi is a great warrior, prime minister, et cetera, et cetera. But there is a rift, no doubt. And the rift is, of course, that Donald Trump has a very different perspective on this issue right now. And he has a totally different outlook where this should go for the United States and not for Israel. And what we do observe in the United States, including in parts of the MAGA group inside of the Republican Party, is that people are fed up with this war. They're fed up that, in their perspective, the US entered this war for the sake of Israel, not for its own sake. And in terms of this ideology of America first, to say it's enough, we don't want to have this situation of Israel first, but America first again. So yes, there is a rift, and it's going to continue, I'm afraid.
Emily, we have to bear in mind, and we hinted at it earlier, that important elections are around the corner in both countries, not just the midterms in the US, of course. How big an influence does that have on the intensity of this confrontation?
I mean, Netanyahu is under enormous pressure in Israel, given that the majority of Israelis support continued fighting. They see this deal, this MOU, as essentially an Israeli failure, and they don't see their goals achieved whatsoever when it comes to Iran's nuclear program, when it comes to Iran's ballistic missile program, the proxies, Lebanon, Hezbollah still standing, still fighting. And so they want to see a continued fighting, especially in Lebanon, given the fact that many Israelis have yet to return to their homes in the north. Many had to be evacuated as a result of the confrontation between the two sides. And that puts Netanyahu on the spot. At the same time, J.D. Vance was very clear when he said, don't bite the hand that feeds you. So it's a tense relationship at the moment. And the question is what Netanyahu is going to choose. Is he going to choose good relations with the US, or is he going to choose the elections?
And just to add to that, his popularity ratings have taken a significant hit. They've dropped by over 10% since March. Hans-Jakob, leaked intelligence suggests that Iran retains about 70% of its pre-war missile arsenal. And the MOU, we talked about it before, doesn't stop them from acquiring new ones. How dangerous could that become for Israel?
Well, I mean, first of all, in military terms, it's really important to distinguish between arsenal and launch capabilities. And the launch capabilities have more significantly been damaged than the arsenal. Of course, they have rockets, but if you can't launch them, that is a problem. Obviously, this regime has survived. Obviously, this regime has not changed one of the basic tenets, which is the destruction of Israel. They've been saying it since 1979. At least from an Israeli perspective, you're going to have to take this seriously. So it will remain a threat unless this, whatever agreement at the end of the negotiation process may or may not happen, really not only controls the enrichment program, but ends it effectively. Any prime minister who gets elected in the end of October in Israel will have to seriously contend with the challenge of having to do this all over again in 18 to 24 months, because obviously the knowledge is still there. So the Iranian side can restart its enrichment program at any point. They still have the 60% highly enriched uranium. It is meant in the MOU to be diluted, but it's unclear how and when. And so we are looking forward to, at best, a couple of years of no war, but then, unless some significant things change, the likelihood of war is going to rise significantly again.
Mm-hmm. Richard, all of that said, isn't it wiser than, rather than choosing confrontation with the U.S., from the Israeli perspective, to push for the U.S. to include Israeli demands and red lines in any deal, even though they're not at the table in Switzerland?
Well, as a matter of fact, there are Israeli officials in Washington right now trying to talk to the administration and make them very clear where the red lines for Israel are. The question is, how much are they heard right now? And from all that we know, the administration in Washington is not very attentive to Israel's needs right now because as we said, we have also the midterm elections in the US, and that's much more important to Donald Trump than the needs of Israel. So he wants, whether this is possible or not is a total different issue, he wants quick results, which he wants to represent as soon as possible to the electorate, so to gain the votes of the voters in the United States. And that's for him right now the most important thing, including, of course, also the markets.
Emily, so the U.S. is watching out for themselves, looking at the midterms. It looks like Netanyahu is stuck between a rock and a hard place here. If he keeps engaging Hezbollah, he risks losing U.S. support. There were open threats of withdrawing support. If he leaves Hezbollah attacks unanswered, though, he risks losing voter support. What are his options here, and which one is more important to him at this stage?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, Nicole. Nobody really knows that. I think Netanyahu has shown that he's has been very good at treading that balance very finely. But of course, he knows that ultimately Israel depends and needs US support for whatever it wants to do in the future. He might also just acquiesce to US demands now, just to further down the line continue the fighting with US support after the midterms. We don't know that. But of course, for now, the elections in Israel are likely going to happen at the end of October. He's looking at these elections. He will have to try and turn this around, at least the look of this deal. We'll have to turn this around for these elections. The question is whether he can do a bit of both, whether he can convince voters that he's still the man, Mr. Security, as he has represented himself for many years, for decades really, whether he can uphold that picture, whether he can, in a way, rectify that image that has taken a dent now through this MOU, through this war, to get him to the elections and ideally for him win these elections, and then further down the line possibly convince Trump to go back to war with Iran. We don't know that, but what we do know is that right now these relationships with this relationship with the US is under intense pressure, and we also don't see Netanyahu respond to that rhetorically much. He's keeping a very low profile.
Hans Jakob, Emily mentioned it earlier, there is overwhelming support for a continuation of the war in Israel. Could Israel potentially continue the war without US support?
Certainly what was attempted at the beginning of this year, i.e. destabilization of the regime, is not something that Israel can do. What Israel can do is target and damage the nuclear program in regular intervals. Obviously, that is going to get harder as time progresses because the Iranians are going to protect their program more, they're going to hide their program better, but it's at least militarily doable. However, that's obviously buying Israel another conflict zone similar to Lebanon, where they will have to attack on a regular basis in order to guarantee their own strategic security, because the regime is still, as one of its core tenets, aiming for the destruction of Israel, not the defeat, the destruction of Israel.
And I want to zoom in on the situation in Lebanon, because despite a ceasefire, hostilities between Israel and the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah continue. The regime in Iran is not amused and has repeatedly threatened to abandon the negotiations over the fighting.
So far, there is no sign the death and destruction in Lebanon will end, despite there being an official ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel. Case in point, the southern Lebanese city of Nabatea, shelled until very recently by the Israeli army during its continuing operations. Many are unhappy that U.S. President Trump is now demanding Israel halt its offensive against Hezbollah. Trust in the U.S. has been deeply shaken. Nearly half of Israelis want the war to continue.
And Israel is a sovereign country that has the right to defend itself.
That the army will leave the yellow zone, that it's called. We will be in a very, very quick situation of October 7th.
For Israel, Iran remains the ultimate enemy due to its potential for building nuclear weapons, and Hezbollah the immediate military threat on its doorstep. Is the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah the biggest obstacle to a peace deal between the U.S. and Iran?
Richard, let me ask you, will the success of these negotiations be decided in Lebanon?
Well, maybe, because this is a huge success, a huge strategic success for Iran to link the two battlefields, Iran and Lebanon, and to be able now to blackmail the international world, not only the US, the international world, and saying, if Israel attacks in Lebanon, if Israel is attacking Hezbollah, that means for us that it has nothing to do anymore with the memorandum. This is a breach of the memorandum. And then we're going away from the negotiating table. And in the worst case, we're going to close the Strait of Hormuz again. Now, in other words, that would mean that the Israeli army cannot defend its borders and cannot defend its own population. And that is something which on the long run, all Israelis, no matter whether they are politically affiliated to, will not accept. And that's also something which a sovereign country cannot accept, no matter the question whether the way Israel is fighting this battle is right or wrong, good or bad. That's a total different issue. But as a matter of fact, this is something where Israel now really sees a betrayal by Donald Trump. And we saw at the beginning when this all started, with the negotiations, that Netanyahu was trying time and again to convince Trump and say, look, these are two different battlefields, don't link it. But he did. And so this is a huge, huge success for Iran.
Hans Jakob, quickly, is that true? Is it two different battlefields? Because Iran is, of course, Hezbollah's backer. They call the shots.
Well, I mean, first of all, linking just Lebanon into this agreement is also a very interesting signal that the regime in Iran sends to its proxy networks, right? So obviously, Hezbollah is important and the rest is expendable. They could have linked Gaza to this conflict as well, and they didn't. So that's it's going to be interesting to see what is going to be the one in the future. The problem that the Iranian side has is that obviously, as far as the MOU is concerned, in this negotiation phase, nothing is going to change on the ground. They are going to be able to maintain their nuclear program as is, and the US is going to be able to maintain the military as is. And as the Iranians can close the Strait of Hormuz for international shipping, the US also can close the Strait of Hormuz for Iranian shipping. They can rescind the waivers for the oil sanctions. So it's a very complicated situation, even from the Iranian perspective. It's not just that all leverage is on the Iranian side. There is quite a lot of leverage also on the US side. They are in a weak position because they've changed from maximum pressure to now essentially accepting that they kind of have to deal with this regime, but it's not without any leverage on the US side.
Emily, Netanyahu promised Israelis total victory over their enemies. Now, if we look at the facts, Hamas still controls about 40% of Gaza. Hezbollah is still attacking the north, and there is no sign of regime change in Iran. Do Israelis still believe its enemies can be defeated by force alone?
Well, according to the polls, they certainly believe that military pressure can put them in a better negotiation position later on. But of course, Gaza has shown that Hamas isn't going anywhere, at least not for now. Also, the past wars that Israel has led in Lebanon in the 80s, went on for almost 20 years, and then also in 2006, didn't actually lead to any political agreements. So Israel in the past has failed to actually translate its military victories into political achievements. And Israelis who have served in those past wars criticize that, and they say that, you know, Israel is sending more and more young soldiers in particular to Lebanon only to come back traumatized and without a political agreement. And of course, if you look at, of course, the military achievements, there is also still, though, and that is something that many Israelis are frightened about, the threat of drones that Hezbollah poses. You see in the last few weeks the use of so-called fiber optic drones that have been able to permeate into the Israeli military where they've been stationed in Lebanon and managed to do quite a bit of damage. And even if you have a buffer zone, the question is just how far and how much can these drones still do? And so there's a general consensus, it seems, in Israel that the fighting has to continue. There has to be at least a minimum a buffer zone to protect the northern communities. But there are still other challenges in this conflict in Lebanon that have to be addressed beyond that.
Richard, we're slowly running out of time, so I'm going to ask you to be brief. J.D. Vance told Israel, and I'm quoting him here, "You can't kill your way out of every national security crisis." Does Israel need a new Iran strategy?
It definitely needs a strategy. It definitely needs politicians who not only want to believe that force alone will make it, and that's one of the biggest problems of this government, and especially for Netanyahu, to have a government full with right extremists who want more war and decisive wars and total wars. So to keep his coalition, he also went into this direction, even though we have to say that also with his past coalitions, he never really developed a strategy, not towards Gaza, not towards Lebanon. And so, yes, they need it, and urgently, they need a strategy.
Hans-Jakob, briefly, last question to you. Will Iran succeed in driving a wedge between the U.S. and Israel?
I think this is overstating the fact. Obviously, there has been better times in the US-Israeli relationships, but there's also been critical times in the past. There is still a broad-based support that sees within the political system in the US, Israel as a key ally in the region, and I can't see that changing at this particular point.
And that's our time. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists. Bye-bye.